We begin, though, of course, this morning with those worrying new developments in Ukraine and the fallout from the decision by Russia's President Vladimir Putin to send troops into two breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine.
Yesterday, President Putin signed a decree. It formally recognizes areas that have been held by separatists as independent states. In a televised address after, Putin said the troops there would be there for, quote, peacekeeping. He described eastern Ukraine as ancient Russian lands and a major part of Russia's history. The West quickly condemned the move. President Biden signed an executive order prohibiting U.S. investment in trade in those rebel territories. The EU and the UK are also preparing sanctions. America's UN ambassador criticized Russia during an emergency Security Council meeting that took place last night.
He has since announced that he will place Russian troops in these regions. He calls them peacekeepers. This is nonsense. We know what they really are. This move by President Putin is clearly the basis for Russia's attempt to create a pretext for a further invasion of Ukraine.
Our team of reporters is standing by to bring us more on this story. NBC News senior White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell is in Washington. We'll get to Kelly in just a moment, but we'll begin with NBC News foreign correspondent Matt Bradley in eastern Ukraine and NBC News reporter Matt Bodner in Moscow. Matt Bradley, let's start with you. What's happening on the ground right now? What's the latest on Russian troop movements in those separatist regions?
Yeah, we just heard the announcement of the materiel that Russia has now sort of eked into those separatist regions, and there were actually two people who were killed overnight, two Ukrainian soldiers, and so. You know, the violence continues, as does the Russian encroachment into those separatist regions. But again, this is the real issue today, is whether or not this actually constitutes something like an invasion. Because remember, as I've been saying time and time again, for a lot of Ukrainians, they see themselves as having been at war with Russia for the past 8 years. Now, in reality, they've been at war sort of with Russian-backed or Russian-led separatists who are also Ukrainians with Russian passports who use the ruble and speak Russian. It's a very confusing and murky situation, and classifying it is a challenge in itself. But when we see these tanks rolling over the border, we have to ask ourselves, will this constitute an invasion? Because President Vladimir Zelensky has just announced that he actually, despite everything of the past that's happened in the past 48 hours, he doesn't see a large-scale invasion in the offing. And again, I think the best explanation for that remarkably cavalier attitude is that he, like many other Ukrainians, see this as a constant state of war. They see the threat from Russia as having never receded. Guys?
Matt Bodner, Russia was widely condemned at last night's emergency UN Security Council meeting. The U.S. and others dispute Russia's claims that it's sending troops on what Russia is calling a peacekeeping mission. How is Moscow justifying this move, and are there signs this could be the start of an invasion?
Thank you, Joe. Well, as for how Moscow is justifying this, we've seen kind of a lot of things thrown out there. There's, of course, the recognition of these two regions as independent states. Those states then signed treaties with Russia, already going through the Russian legislature. Putin, of course, as you mentioned, ordering in peacekeepers as part of their initial recognition agreement. And in Putin's speech itself, he made kind of a historical argument that seemed to undermine directly undermined the Ukraine's claim to being a state at all. And we also are hearing all these claims about, Ukrainian aggression against Russian-speaking people in eastern Ukraine. So let's say you were in that Security Council meeting last night. You would have heard Russia's representative there making a form of this argument. Let's take a listen.
The last few weeks already, whipping up unfounded panic around the allegedly impending Russian invasion of Ukraine. Our Western colleagues have been unashamedly cramming weapons into the country, sending instructors there, essentially nudging the Ukrainians who have concentrated an 120,000 strong military contingent along the contact line towards an armed provocation against Donbass.
So we're hearing a lot of stuff like that. Like further to your question about is this preparation for an invasion, rhetorically, the groundwork is certainly being laid. But one thing really to keep a close eye on is the actual specifics of recognition for Luhansk and Donetsk. The rebels control a much smaller portion of that territory than is actually kind of formally recognized by Ukraine. And so there's this back and forth now. Do these claims basically contain a large part of territory that Ukraine's government still controls. Will that be justification? We don't know. That's, like I said, the major question now.
Matt Bradley, let's talk about Ukraine's president. He spoke to his country soon after President Putin ordered his troops into those regions. What was his message? Is Ukraine satisfied with these initial sanctions now from the West?
No, I mean, Ukraine has always held the same line. They think that the sanctions shouldn't be reactive. They should be peremptory. They think that the sanctions should go against Russia now, rather than waiting for Russia to take more action. Well, Russia's taken action, and the sanctions are coming. They're probably going to want more crushing sanctions to dissuade Russia from doing anything else. But we're hearing from Vladimir Zelensky again today, after that address he made last night. He's sounding remarkably optimistic, and that's because of the limited nature of the incursion that we saw or we are seeing right now in real time. And because that's the line he's been hewing toward the entire time for the last several weeks. So this is something that you could classify as wishful thinking. In reality, I think it's just that this country is used to being in a state of war, and so is its president. So really looking forward, it's really going to matter what Russia does. The ball is now in their court, and the world is really waiting to see what they do. President Vladimir Zelensky is in that same position. He has to wait and see. Guys?
Matt Bodner, very quickly, I mean, does Putin fear these new sanctions?
It doesn't seem so. I mean, throughout this entire thing, they've basically directly addressed this situation and said, we think we're going to get sanctioned no matter what. That's a bit kind of like a domestic talking point. Russia has already faced a lot of sanctions for its actions, and the general kind of experience for Russians under sanctions is, on the one hand, it's been a bit of an economic boom. On the other hand, it's never really seemed to kind of have the direct biting impact that some of kind of the proponents of sanctions in the West might have hoped. But of course, we're talking about substantially larger sanctions, more significant sanctions in certain regards, still being held in reserve to try to deter further Russian action. So we'll just have to see. But basically, the mood in Moscow is we're not afraid of your sanctions.
Matt Bodner in Moscow, Matt Bradley in Ukraine. Thank you both.
And let's pick the conversation up right there with NBC News senior White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell in Washington this morning. Kelly, let's continue this conversation on the latest on these sanctions. So President Biden responded to the Russian advances by imposing new sanctions. That was on those two separatist regions of Ukraine. And last night, Deputy National Security Advisor Jonathan Feiner said more are on the way. First, let's listen to that.
We will continue to assess what Russia does overnight. We are going to be imposing significant sanctions on Russia tomorrow.
So, Kelly, it's tomorrow. Tell us, what kind of action are we expecting from the White House today?
Well, we expect this next phase of reaction from the Biden administration, and they have not yet defined what that will look like. So the first wave of sanctions that we saw imposed really was very targeted and very limited. And as you heard in our colleague's earlier report, may not have a lot of impact on Vladimir Putin at this point. Targeted to the two regions within Ukraine that have now been sort of adopted by Putin. He declared that they belong to Russia, and so the U.S. is targeting any trade and financing and business done in those places as a first step. So today, the question will be, how robust will sanctions be beyond that? What we have not yet seen is the kind of broad sanctions that we have heard talked about among the U.S. and its European allies for weeks, if not months now. And part of that really goes back to the whole idea of when does Putin's activity and when does his aggression trigger something of a certain scale? You might remember there was a lot of controversy when, during the president's press conference back in January, he talked about a minor incursion. Is that what this is right now, with Putin claiming two parts of Ukrainian sovereign territory as his own? Is that what they're talking about, or will he go beyond that? So it's still early in Washington, of course, so they have not defined what these new sanctions will be today. But that's the top question we'll be looking at, as to see what the U.S. is learning about any steps overnight that have happened on the ground and where they want to go, and what European partners are saying as well. Savannah?
So, Kelly, just yesterday, this conversation that we were really having about the White House and the Kremlin was about this agreement in principle to a meeting. Now, here we're talking about these sanctions today. Does this advancement by Russia close the door on that potential meeting, on diplomacy in general?
Well, we've put that question to top officials, and they are not closing the door to diplomacy, in part because even as aggression begins, you need diplomacy sometimes to wind it down, to have a ceasefire, to take other kinds of steps to try to cool things off. So they're not closing the door. But at the same time, Putin's actions and his disregard for the national rules of Ukraine and the international order of the United Nations certainly changes things. And so what we don't know is, will there be the step that was going to happen first, which would be Antony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, and Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, meeting. That could still happen as a way to try to see where things are. The prospect of a Biden-Putin summit always seemed far off and seems even more far off today.
And
Savannah?
Kelly, quickly, you just posed this question. When does his aggression trigger a full-scale reaction? Is there concern internationally about that, this international resolve to move to take a more firm stance against Russia?
Well, one of the things that Putin has done here is he has put the West in a bit of a box by taking a piece of Ukraine that was the most predictable piece and not yet going beyond that. It is raising some questions about how much the European community, NATO and the West want to do in response, trying to be measured, trying to not provoke something that goes beyond that. So it is strategically crafty, if you will, on the part of Putin to take this incremental step first. The question for Western allies will be how best to respond to that, and how much more does Putin have in mind. So it's really a incremental stage right now. Very worrying, very concerning, certainly not what the West wants to see, but he has not yet taken the action like going after the Capitol, that kind of thing, which would certainly trigger a different level of response. Savannah?
All right, Kelly O'Donnell in Washington for us. Thank you so much.
Coronavirus cases are falling across the country, and more states are rolling back restrictions. NBC News national correspondent Miguel Almaguer takes a look at our new normal and the new criticism the CDC is now facing.
It's not just the dramatic drop in hospitalizations, but the sharp decline in infections, down 64%, that could help pave the way for the CDC to roll back national masking guidance this week, while it's unclear if there'll be any impact on airplanes and public transit like the subway.
When we treat others with
In states like New York and California, there is pressure to unmask in the classroom, despite low vaccination rates for children and the CDC's guidance to keep them.
We will be announcing a specific date, that date with destiny. The masks will come off.
With the CDC already under scrutiny, the New York Times says the agency isn't publishing large portions of data it's collecting, like the effectiveness of boosters for younger Americans and signs of the virus in wastewater. The agency telling the paper some raw data could be misinterpreted.
The CDC is obligated to provide us with excellent data. I think if they have preliminary data that are not yet internally consistent or robust or validated, they are under no obligation to provide those data, which would only be confusing.
As our nation remains eager for a new normal, several new studies show 3 doses of a COVID vaccine, or even 2, could offer longer protection from serious illness and death.
whether to get a booster or not is going to become more of an option, with the exception of very specific settings or occupations. I think for most people, it'll really be about their own sense of risk.
An evolving pandemic as our future begins to resemble our past. Miguel Almaguer, NBC News.
Let's now bring in NBC News medical contributor Dr. Natalie Azar for more on this. Dr. Azar, always great to have you with us. So many states are now shifting to treating the virus as an endemic rather than a pandemic. Health officials are still monitoring subvariants, though. There's this BA2. How do we make sense of loosening restrictions while there's still this potential of a variant? How do we essentially live with this virus?
Well, Savannah, that really is the tension here. I think that as much as we're sort of striving for this concept of endemicity and how we're going to live that way, I'm not sure, number one, that we're there yet. And number two, we're really doing this by trial and error. As you mentioned, we do have the threat of the subvariant BA2 lurking. It is more transmissible, which means that we had a very, very steep rise in our Omicron cases, and we're seeing a steep fall, but that subvariant could really sort of what the experts are calling extend that tail. And what that means is that we're looking at significantly more deaths. We still are having over 100,000 cases a day, and we're still having 2,000 deaths a day. This is still well above where I think all of us would feel comfortable settling into sort of an expectation the way we do around influenza, Savannah. So, as one expert put it, I'd rather have those masks on for a month too long than a month too short. We've been here before. We were surprised when Delta receded and Omicron came up. I think we always have to be very, very nimble and flexible in terms of our responses.
One of the things I want to ask you about now is a tool that we've got to keep fighting this, which is testing. I mean, for most of the pandemic, we relied on testing so much to keep COVID from spreading, to understand where breakouts were happening, to really dictate our own actions. What happens to testing now? Do we need to be testing as often? We're seeing other countries not make quarantine as much of a focus anymore. What does this mean? How should testing fit in?
Right. I mean, I think that testing still does need to be an integral part of our approach to this. It's not something that I think just goes by the wayside. I think the urgency for testing is reduced in terms of, the doing broad testing in schools and offices and things like that may go away as long as our case rates stay low and our hospitalizations are low and our ICUs are not at capacity. I think there's a lot of metrics that experts are going to use to make those recommendations, Savannah. But we know that testing, just like isolating when you're sick and symptomatic and things like that, are still going to be here. They're not going away.
All right, Dr. Natalie Azar, thank you so much. And if you at home have a question for one of our wonderful doctors, let us know. Email us at morningnewsnow@nbcuni.com with your questions, and let us know if you want to stay anonymous.
Jury deliberations are underway in the federal hate crimes trial for the 3 men convicted of killing Ahmaud Arbery. Both prosecutors and defense attorneys made their closing arguments to the jury yesterday. Gregory and Travis McMichael, along with William Roddy Bryan, already face life sentences after they were convicted on state charges. Verdict in this federal trial could come as soon as today. Tomorrow is the 2-year anniversary of the day Arbery was killed. NBC News correspondent Ron Allen joins us now from Brunswick, Georgia. So, Ron, good morning to you. First of all, recap, what did we hear from both the prosecution and defense during yesterday's closing arguments?
Joe, this case comes down to motive. Why did the men do what they did? The basic facts of the case are not in dispute. This is not another murder trial. It's about whether or not the defendants, the McMichaels and William Roddy Bryan, went after, chased Ahmaud Arbery and shot and killed him because he is black. It's as simple and as complicated as that. The prosecution insists that everything that the men did, or so many things that they did, was because of Arbery's race, and were he not black, this would not have happened. The defense maintains that they pursued Arbery because they thought he was a suspect, because they thought he was behind or responsible for a string of burglaries, robberies in the neighborhood, although there was no evidence really of that presented during either trial, essentially. So that's what this comes down to. That's what the charges are, that of federal hate crimes, trespassing, kidnapping, and use of a firearm. It's not about murder. It's about whether the McMichaels and William Roddy Bryan did what they did because of Arbery's race. Joe?
So, Ron, as we mentioned, tomorrow will be 2 years to the day since Arbery was killed. We have seen his family front and center throughout this hate crimes trial, as well as during the murder trial. How are they doing now as this trial nears a possible conclusion?
They're hanging in there. It's very tough for families to go through this, a trial like this again, to see that video that we've all seen again and again played at this trial as well as the first one. Here's a bit of Wanda Cooper-Jones, Arbery's mother, speaking after the final arguments came and the case went to the jury. Take a listen.
I think the DOJ presented the case well, and I think we're going to get a good verdict at the end. Very emotional. This has been very draining, and I'm thankful that it's almost over.
So far, the jury has deliberated for about 2.5 hours or so. They begin here at 9 a.m. and the trial was brief. It was 4 days of testimony, 5 hours or so of closing arguments. So it was very condensed. It wasn't nearly as long as the state trial. Whether that means the jury will come back sooner or later, of course, we don't know. But again, 2 hours so far, and they begin deliberations again at 9 o'clock this morning.
Ron Allen in Georgia. Ron, thank you so much.
And now let's get a check on your morning news now weather.
Michelle Grossman is with us this morning. Hey, Michelle.
Good morning to both of you. Well, we are really busy this morning. The radar is lit up. We're watching strong storms, and we're also watching snow this morning. We've been watching strong storms, even some tornado warnings since overnight hours. We continue to watch them this morning, and we will continue to watch them throughout the day. So this is what it looks like on radar. You can see all that rain down to the south, lightning, hearing some thunder as well. And then the blue, that is the snow. So this will be the story as we go throughout the day. Very busy today. Then another storm is on deck for tomorrow. So we do have coast-to-coast storms. We have winter weather alerts for 28 million people from the west to the northern plains, the Great Lakes, central and southern plains, even over to the interior northeast. And that's because we're going to see more snow later on this week. Wind chill and freeze alerts for 16 million in the pink. We're seeing wind chills as low as 30, 35 below zero, dangerously cold this morning in some spots. Flood alerts because we're expecting heavy rain. We're seeing that happening with some of these storms right now. So 42 million under those flood alerts and 11 million under a severe threat through tonight. Where you see that yellow, that's where we're seeing it right now. We're going to continue to see it throughout the day. There's a sharp boundary between that cold air and the warm air. So Paducah, we're looking at Nashville, Memphis, Tupelo, Jackson. You could see damaging winds, some hail, and even some isolated tornadoes. Up to 4 inches of rain in some spots. It's happening pretty quickly too. So we could see some flash flooding. That's a lot of rain, but when it comes in such a short time, that's when we get the problems. I mentioned those wind chill alerts stretching to the southern plains. Again, wind chills as low as 35 below zero. So you guys, it is busy. We're going to continue to track this storm and then the one on deck for tomorrow too.
All right. Thank you, Michelle. Appreciate it.
5 below zero. Woo. Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.